Hello, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Secure Corporate Growth by Decreasing the Cyber Risk of IoT. My name is Shayla Hankey, the Director of Marketing at Great Bay Software, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you to submit your questions via the questions module within the GoToWebinar tool, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. We'll also send a copy of the recording after the webinar. Today's presentation will be given by Dino Balafas, VP of Marketing and Product Strategy at Great Bay Software, where he brings more than 25 years of marketing, product strategy, and product management experience to the organization. Most recently, he served as VP of Global Marketing and Product Management at TeamQuest Corporation, where he drove big data, predictive analytics, and microservices initiatives. And prior to TeamQuest, he served as VP of Products and Services at DataCard, where he led the global business focused on secure banking and government transactions. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dino.
Well, thank you, Shayla, and welcome all. Thank you for participating with us today. What I'd like to do is go through and take a look at what's going on inside the market and talk a little bit about security and how we can address security through looking at our organizational maturity at solving some of the security problems that we have within the financial institutions primarily. First thing, and this is a little bit of a motherhood and apple pie sort of statement, what is the most important priority going on inside the businesses today? Well, from recent CEO surveys, not surprising to find out that business growth is by far the most important aspect of their business, what they want to accomplish in the short term. What we've seen, though, is only 40% of these banking CEOs really feel that the revenue growth, they'll be able to drive the revenue growth over the next 12 months, so over the next year. So it really makes you wonder why that is. And the majority of them say that the issue for growth is around the lack of trust in their business. It's threatening their growth. Lack of their trust from their customers into their business, and what might be driving that trust or getting in the way of that trust going forward. Well, certainly one of them is all the news that we see going on in terms of cybersecurity and cyber breaches. And I don't mean to be picking on any particular companies here. I just happen to do a quick web search on cyber security breaches. And of course, the bigger banks had the higher sorting criteria and came to the fore. But if we take a look at just a few of them, JP Morgan a little over a year ago came up with 83 million records that were compromised within their organization from a cyber breach. Also led to a lot of lawsuits. More recently, Equifax, which affected 143 million people in the United States with their financial records. Certainly, I think it was the biggest breach in a while. To give them a little bit of a benefit is Equifax was able to find this breach within 90 days, which is, believe it or not, is less than the industry average in terms of recognizing a breach. Seen a lot of data around here from Gartner and other sources. I've seen it anywhere from about 101 days to as many as 140 days that a breach has occurred before it's recognized internally. A big problem when you're losing data records inside of a banking institution or really any other institution that you have going forward. So these all factor into reducing the overall trust of an organization. But how does that impact the business overall? This research coming out of Phenomen in 2017 that's looking at a cost from a breach standpoint. They look specifically at customer churn. So the number of customers that are lost inside of an organization after a breach has been found. And the highest factor, the highest industry that gets the most impact is the financial industry, where they see a 5.7% churn in their customer base. Health is second at 5.5%. One thing that I like to joke about with my team here is it seems that most people are more worried about losing their money than they're losing their lives in a breach. Anyway, significant impact in the overall organization. The overall organization success during a breach, a security breach within their within their company. What's also funny is you look at the lowest impacted regarding a security breach, and that's the public sector. And I guess the only thing you can say is it's good to be a monopoly and don't have to worry about people leaving. So how do we take a look at building trust with the organization, and how does it relate specifically to the security breaches that we've been seeing going on? Well, 76% of banking CEOs agree that managing people's data is a way of differentiating them going forward. So this is an area of growth and a way that they're going to attract new customers going forward. So what are some of the aspects that drive this differentiation? Well, digital services, for example, is one of the areas. As new services are being deployed within the bank, be it online banking, be it applications that are being run on the mobile apps, etc. This allows differentiation. This allows growth within the organization. It also, on the downside, provides more opportunities for cyber threats to come into the organization. Other areas of growth within here is the data analytics that can be collected from the customer base, the usage that customers are using, so better business decisions can be made in terms of providing services in the future. And then lastly is just convenience of operation. A lot easier to check my cell phone on my bank account, for example, than going into a bank and getting a statement. So all of these are ways of driving future growth within an organization, and most of them relate to adding services that target digital type services and therefore potential security breaches, cybersecurity breaches within the organization. When I look at how do we shore up security, and I get this question a lot from our customer base, hey, it's really expensive. I really only want to pass compliance is often a structure. You know, it's really expensive to implement all aspects of cybersecurity. I don't even know where to start, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all very relevant questions. The good news is that one size in security doesn't fit all. You don't need to put in a secure environment to the level of the NSA, for example, to mitigate and reduce your overall risk footprint within the organization. Moreover, as you take a look at the types of services that you're deployed, you can make decisions in terms of the level of security that you want to implement within the organization. That can be software related in terms of the tools that you have, but it's also much more broadly focused than that. It can relate around governance, risk and compliance. So taking a look at what sort of policies that you have within your organization to examine your risk profile, to improve and set up plans for future growth in terms of reducing your risk, and for monitoring situations that are going inside the operation to highlight when, if a breach might be happening, how do you react to it, how do you quickly remediate it going forward. There's a security architecture aspect to it as well, in terms of how do you want to architect that risk, and I've already covered a little bit on the operational side. So what I want to do going forward in the rest of the presentation is really focus in on some of these areas to better understand how we might be able to size the appropriate security offering or what you implement internally to address your particular needs within an organization. So one of the models I like, this came from FFIEC and then also NIST security framework. It's really to take a look at two parts of a matrix. So one is measure your inherent risk of the organization and then compare that with your relative maturity level within the organization. So as you can see with the blue squares, as your risk profile goes up, meaning as you bring in new devices, new services that add more inherent risk to the environment, you do need to associate more maturity in how you respond to those risks, more maturity in how you monitor and frame up your architecture of your environment to mitigate those risks. So in a relatively unsophisticated organization, maybe a bank that has only a single branch that's not doing a lot of online services, you certainly do not need the same level of security deployment as maybe a tier one bank, a large organization that's doing international banking, for example, has a myriad of electronic services and has a lot of threats happening to them every day, people trying to hack in and get financial data for them. So want to cover these areas and give you some things and criteria to think about in order to match where you're at with risk and your maturity and what you might want to adjust as you grow and try to take advantage of financial growth, deploying cyber services in the future. So let's first take and define the maturity of the organization. So what do we mean by that? Well, really divided into 5 areas. First, in the base level or level 1 would be another way of looking at it, is really centered around what I would call baseline. And this is basically the minimum to be effective by law. So it's really more of a compliance-driven organization. What do I need to pass my next compliance audit? And that's about it. Base level, and we'll talk in more detail how you would address that particular level of maturity that's required. Second is what we will call the evolving or level 2. Primary thing that you would see being deployed in this area is having someone accountable for cybersecurity. So there is a person responsible for cybersecurity. That individual will generally start writing up formal documents and procedures and policies within the organization. So what to do, what our security posture is, if it's tools, what tools are we deploying, how often do they need to be refreshed, and then take a look at where the biggest risks are in the organization and start asking questions within the organization of, well, what's the best way of resolving that? The intermediate level, level 3, is taking it to really another level more detailed. So one of the things that we see in these areas is there's actually validation that the systems in place are working. So they're being validated through testing. In other words, a mock breach might be incurred. How would someone pay a third party to come in and try to hack into your environment and see what the findings are so that you can fix and patch up any holes that you may have in that area? You'll also see more maturity happen within the documents themselves. You'll get into a more detailed procedures and policies. So whereas the evolving might say these are the types of software applications that are being deployed, the level 3 would be, and if they're not deployed, this is the escalation to make sure that happens. This gets reported to such and such a group, and then they're responsible within 30 days to take action. That would be an example of that. So we see this at the intermediate level, security being integrated into the business strategy. It's important to the organization. They see it as a way of growing, differentiating. At level 4, the advanced area, this is taking a look at, and really what's indicated here is when you have a continuous improvement plan for the company. So maybe on a quarterly basis, you're reviewing your plans. You've had some reporting mechanisms to show if what you've deployed is effective. So you have measurement tools. On an annual basis, you're putting together a budget regarding how to improve the overall organization security and continually reviewing that to get better at security and have a predictive method of growing security applications, process, governance, etc., within the organization. There's someone accountable at the senior level. You usually see a CISO, CISO implemented at this stage of an organization, and they may be reporting into the board or certainly into the senior leadership team on where they are to that process, to their plans and process, and see if they're maintaining and growing their plans to address future needs. Last level is the innovative side. At this level, really security is a top-down and a bottom-up sort of approach. It has representation at the board level. It's reported at the board level. It's basically everything that we've seen except at a more strategic level, continuous improvement processes that are being deployed for people, process, and the technology. So looking at the technologies, making sure that they're being refreshed, maybe new tools being brought in, processes are constantly being examined, and people are being trained. So at a high level, these are really the 5 levels of maturity and what's going on in each of those levels. Now, if we look at risk, so we take a look at the matrix that we have and we go across the horizontal plane, so from least to most, there's really a number of criteria that we look at and need to assess to see how risky the organization is. There's really 5 categories. One is focused in around technology and connection types. So what we're interested in understanding in this area is what's being connected into the network and what are we deploying in terms of services. Are we using an ISP? Might be at the low level. Most people are. Can't imagine an organization not using the internet today. What sort of outsourced services are we using for the organization? If we have outsourced, that creates higher risk because those are not more entry points inside the financial institution that can be exploited. Are we allowing wireless access, for example? Wireless is a little harder to identify where threats are coming from, so we're a little less certain in terms of who's at the other end of the communication. Size of the network's an important factor in this area as well. Small network doesn't have as many entry points. It's easier to monitor as well, so less risky. You have a international organization with 100,000 people working within the organization. The internal threat, you service millions of customers. That's a more complex organization. It increases your overall risk. And lastly, do you allow personal devices? How are those personal devices being utilized inside and outside the organization? These add more threat vectors into the particular company. So we look at delivery channels. Now this is looking at the bank specifically. Smaller banks, financial institution in branch only, meaning one location or a small set of locations. Less worrisome than adding services like online banking, more multiple points into the bank, mobile banking, getting through applications that are being run on cell phones, for example, that allow more entry points, and again, getting the wireless access aspect. ATMs, are those ATMs international, for example? More access into a network that can be exploited, kiosks and other things as well, all add to the risk level. When we look at some of the specific services that are being deployed, credit versus debit cards, are you utilizing those as services for your bank? Are they outsourced? Are they being produced within your bank? Each of those add higher security footprints, person-to-person transactions, automated clearinghouses add a significant level of potential breach, wireless transfers, and we've seen a lot of this in the news where people interject transfers for down payments in homes, and they're being sent to banks, Cayman Islands, outside the United States, and the money's gone, remote deposits. Each one of these, again, offer more chances of cyber threats and exploitation, and therefore increase your risk. Organizational characteristics also factor into it. Have you done an M&A, a merger and acquisition? It's the marrying of disparate systems at that particular part and processes, and usually what happens is there's gaps created in those areas. So if you've had one, that's an area of concern. Employee size, contractors, are your contractors local? Are your contractors with a company that work in the U.S., but they're bringing in various people from around the U.S.? Do you know what their backgrounds are like, for example? Are they contractors that are, for cost reasons, being serviced outside the United States? That adds more risk as well to get into your environment. Privileged access, and then there's a number of locations. Are you local, regional, national, or international? Each one adding a higher risk factor. And then lastly, don't ignore, are we being threatened today? If you have cyber attacks happening on a daily basis within your organization, you need to be more secure. There are people there are bad people out there that are looking and seeing as a potential way of them gaining money, financial gain by exploiting you, and are looking at doing that as well. So these all add, as you go down or scale down in these lists, they're adding more and more risk, or adding a significant more risks to your environment, and they need to be thought of as you adopt more security measures within your company. So we looked at the inherent risk profile. Now let's take the maturity levels and understand what constitutes maturity within your organization. So we looked at baseline up to innovative and define those. Let's talk about what brings you up in terms of maturity. So when we look at governance, for example, or the first area, the first domain, if you will, of cybersecurity, we look at things like governance. Do we have IT asset management systems deployed, for example, on understanding where all of our assets are? If you don't know what's out on the network and you don't know what's being utilized inside the organization, it's hard to remediate or track abnormal usage in the area. Risk, how effectively are we auditing and managing risk within the organization? Do we have training programs for the employees? And this is one of the things that I really like to highlight. One of the lower cost items with the highest rate of return is training people that people are touching data, working with customers, not only the security people utilizing the services within the organization, are they being trained and being aware of security? Do they know when they're providing information that would be classified as private or protected in some way? Very important aspect. When we look at, in terms of maturity, there's also threat and intelligence, collaboration. So taking a look at the acquisition of information, identifying and tracking where that's coming from. When we look at monitoring, how is that being instituted? Where are the threats within the monitoring of that information? How are they being acted upon? In more sophisticated organizations, they may have a SOC, security operational control system. In less mature organizations, it might just be an individual that will follow up and track threats. If we look at domain number 3, cybersecurity and control, we're looking at tools and processes that will help us more effectively manage what's going on with infrastructure, protection of assets. They might be computing assets. They might be, as we get into the Internet of Things, external assets, like HVAC systems, for example, that are running your climate control within your bank. Those do have potential threats coming through them. They can be exploited in terms of being able to utilize and extract data from the organization. When we look at prevention and controls, what infrastructure management, access management, and security endpoint management, both from a physical point of view and from a cyber point of view. So is the bank being locked up? Do we have vaults? Things that have been utilized for a long period of time, but also then what are we doing in terms of deploying services that will monitor as effectively our cyber endpoints within the network. And then the corrective actions that can be taken place. Software vulnerabilities, do we have a patch management remediation policy? Are we fulfilling it? How often are we bringing in patches? The WannaCry virus that came up earlier this year, 2017, was exploiting a known problem out in the market that if patches were maintained would not have been an issue going forward. So external dependency management, we touched on this before. One of the key aspects is understanding who's working within your organization and can you trust them? Do they have policies in vetting and doing background checks, for example, of their employees? Are they international? What do they do to make sure and to manage the integrity of their organizations? Understanding their policies and making sure they're adhering to those is very important in terms of the overall maturity of an organization. And then lastly, the incident reporting, taking a look at steps of how do you identify and prioritize issues, and then how are they escalated and how are they reported on. A relatively recent example, this would be Uber, which was hacked and they didn't tell anyone. And this might be a policy that they'll want to rethink going forward in terms of how to escalate and be a better player to their customer base. So we've taken a look at risk and relative risk levels within an organization. We've taken a look at maturity and then how to grow maturity at a high level. I do want to cite a few specific examples. I pulled this out of FFIEC, and it's related specifically to financial organization. They have some 80 criteria. I've only taken a snapshot of a few of them just to illustrate how these areas, these services that are being deployed relate to risk. So for example, ISP connections. I can't imagine a branch that doesn't have one, but if you don't have one, from a risk standpoint, least risky, you don't need as much or have to worry about as much with that. Less than 20, minimal, 100 or less, then you're starting to get in the moderate range, and that's because now the volume of interactions are increasing, the number of potential threat vectors coming into the organization is increasing. 200 and less, roughly, for significant. Anything above 200 would be in the most range. Take a look at wireless network access. Again, you're at the minimum level if you have a separate access point for your guests coming into the bank, for your employees. Then as you get into logically separated network access, or a volume of 125 concurrent users at one time, that raises your risk profile. Corporate-wide networks in concurrent of 1,000 users gets you into a significant area, which increases relatively rapidly when you start taking a look at the number. And then if all employees have access via wireless services into the bank, and that's over 1,000 type of employees or guest services being utilized, that's adding a significant risk to the overall environment. Look at online services, browser, text-based, minimum level. You start getting into mobile banking, paying bills online, check services, you're already at the moderate level. External wire transfers, significant level, fully functioning wire transfers that are internationally, you're at the highest level. ATMs, for example, if you don't deploy services, you don't have to worry about that. If you do have services that are unowned machines, in other words, you're not servicing them, they're being maintained and secured by other organizations, a little less risky than if you're deploying your own regional or national or international ATM systems, all providing more access points within the company. Look at debit cards, credit cards, third-party issued versus direct issued cards. In higher volumes of 100,000, you start moving up the risk ladder significantly. So larger banks will run into that as well. And then wire transfers. What's the type of volume of assets that are being translated, being moved daily? Is it regional? Is it national? Is it international? Each one of those provide footprints of higher risk going forward. So when you take a look at the services that you're deploying within your organization, and you look at these types of services that you're deploying, where do you line up in terms of your risk level? So if you take a thought on that, understand what you've got in terms of your risk level, and then what you've deployed in terms of governance, monitoring, reporting, the types of tools that you have internally, how you're monitoring it to get a gauge on your maturity level. Ideally, you'll be able to plug yourself into one of these categories. So if you're on we're a pretty small organization and we have lower risk, we don't need as much maturity. So things like firewalls, antivirus, malware are the types of things, maybe some encryption that are going on as well, are really all you need to deploy in those types of environment. Would I say don't deploy more? No, I wouldn't. Always more security is better. But you don't need to be as sophisticated as maybe the next level, where you start getting into the minimal level or level 2 that we had talked about earlier, where endpoint visibility starts becoming very important. Why? Because you're getting more data, more endpoints that are starting to access your system. They're coming from harder to monitor areas like mobile applications. Network segmentation becomes interesting and important. Why? That's a way of mitigating risk that if a breach occurs, making it harder for the attacker to get into various aspects of your organization. So segmenting your environment puts up more barriers, slows down proliferation of access, and therefore mitigates the damage that a threat can occur. Vulnerability assessments as well. And this is really getting more on the governance side, starting to take a look at running systems, third parties coming in, identifying your gaps. When you get into the moderate area, you want to utilize the previously mentioned items, and then you're getting more sophisticated into automated enforcement. So isolating threats that are coming in, maybe quarantining a particular device until you better understand it. And in situations where you have tens of thousands of users or large organizations, it's hard to react quickly, so having some automated services is important. Keeping a SIM together, so centralizing your control of security and your environment, your event management, important aspect for this stage, so that you can analyze what's going on in a more sophisticated, larger organization. When we look at the next level, getting into sophisticated and then into the highest innovative area, your artificial intelligence starts coming into play here, where you might be monitoring behavior and then analyzing what usage of that, what's normal usage for those particular endpoints, and do we see abnormal behavior on a large scale. So being able to use automation tools that can take a look at a baseline and see if things are deviating from that baseline. For example, a printer should probably not be transferring files outside the organization. That would be hard to detect in a large organization that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of endpoints, but it is something that artificial intelligence could take advantage of and identify relatively quickly, so it could be shut down. A SOC for centralizing reactions to threats and how to handle those, and then penetration testing within the organization, detailed reports on what's going on. When we look at the highest level, sophisticated integrations, usually in these areas, they have very large security staffs, and frankly, they're probably driving the overall innovation in the industry, deploying their own services, deploying their own security tools, their own methodologies, and they tend to lead the market. And I've had the benefit and privilege to be in some of these large banking organizations. It's amazing. I remember one of them had 8,000 dedicated security people that were driving the security for the financial institution to mitigate risk. Very, very important to them. They took the 5.7 financial loss to heart, and were willing to spend that type of money to remediate threats. So a few critical questions to ask yourself as you're thinking about implementing security and maturing your security for your organization. One is, what's connected to the network? I like to use the analogy that if you have a house and you don't know where all the doors are, it's difficult to define what sort of locks you need to put on them. Where are they located? Where are the devices coming on or located? Using an understanding of the type of threats. How are they behaving? This is getting into the behavior analytics that I was citing in the previous slide. You shouldn't have things like printers talking or executing in ways that are very abnormal. And then lastly, the question is, do I trust it and should I? To go forward with each of the devices coming on the environment. A few other best practices just to round out our conversation is Understanding and disabling access to devices. So a lot of times, for example, you might leave USB ports open in devices that people that you don't know may have access to, people that you don't trust may have access to it. It's easy to disable those items, so someone can't pop in a USB data device and load a virus or load a Trojan horse of some example. Disabling unsecured protocols for the organization. I mean, file transfers are important, etc., but not every device necessarily needs that. You can turn those off where they're not utilized, turn off those ports, at least at a minimum monitor those ports to understand what sort of usage is going over it, and you can flag abnormal behavior so that you can quickly resolve a security issue that might be coming up. This doesn't happen often enough, but changing defaults. Hackers do know applications and do know the default passwords and administration accounts. A very effective way and easy way for breaches to occur. One of the things to also take a look at is keep an eye and ensure that communication ports that should be open are, like Secure Shell, for example, HTTP, for example. These can be monitored. Typically, an attack protocol or a hacker that's coming in will disable these to mitigate their interference of how they're navigating through your particular environment so that they're able to reap as much damage or collect as much information as they want. And then lastly, patch. Make sure that everything's current, everything's up to date. Again, WannaCry and a few of the others that happened this year was because patches weren't implemented in a timely manner. The one thing that I'll say, especially as the Internet of Things grows, this is not always possible. A lot of devices and equipment that's being provided out of the network cannot get agents or do not lend themselves to be getting new patches loaded onto them. So they can be permanent security threats for your organization. So being able to monitor those, especially at the endpoint and how they're connecting, is very important. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your participation. I'm going to open up for questions in just a moment. But if you do have any questions for me directly, my email is included here in the slides, dbeloffice@greatbaysoftware.com, or what I would really encourage you and welcome you is to check out our resource website on greatbaysoftware.com. On that website, we have analyst reports, we have solution case studies, so case studies from some of the deployments that we've used internally. You may be able to glean some information that aligns to some of the problems you're trying to solve today, and being able to drive some best practices, or at least take a look at how others have solved the problems. We do have some best practice guides there, and industry reports and a whole lot more. So it's a good site. Most of it's not salesy. They're provided as resources for you. So with that, Sheila.
All right, thanks, Dino.
Over to you.
So just as a quick reminder to everybody, we will send a copy of this recorded presentation to everybody after the webinar. And so with that, let's jump into Q&A. We did receive a couple, so here's one. You mentioned that knowing what's connected to the network at all times is critical. How have you seen other organizations achieve this?
So one of the problematic things around this, and I touched on it in just the last slide, is a number of the items, especially as we get more and more systems being put on the network. So light bulb systems to save energy, or wireless devices that are coming online, pose a greater threat. So understanding what endpoints are being connected is important. Since we can't deploy agents on all items, and agentless design is really where the industry is going to have to mature to, and it's actually an area of focus that we've had for many years here at Great Bay. And what we do in that type of design is listen to what's going on in the overall environment. So we understand what's being connected in real time to the network so that those endpoints can be evaluated in terms of threats. You can augment that with behavior analytics as well. Understanding what's being connected can generate a profile. So for example, that's an iPhone out there. They generally are running these types of operating systems. They generally have these types of usage characteristics. And is the usage being deviated from? And if so, how do I alert an organization? How do I alert the security people that this seems nefarious, or maybe even take an automated measure in isolating it so that it won't have access to internal files until the organization is able to figure out if it's a real threat or if it's just someone bringing an errant, undocumented product into the environment. So those are some items to think about as you address that.
Perfect. Let's take one more question. We've got time for one more. This is a comment and a question. Thanks for this maturity risk framework. It's really great. How often do you recommend revisiting it to see how the security maturity stacks up?
Great question. I like that one a lot. So in the most sophisticated organizations, so if you look at the risk scale, the ones furthest to the right, on the most, I think it was deemed the most, level 5, let's call it. They're looking at it. They have policies and procedures already in place, and they have escalation procedures, and they're looking at it literally on in a real-time basis. In less sophisticated organizations don't have as high of a risk profile. You certainly want to have at least quarterly reviews in that area to policies, procedures. You should have measurements that you're tracking on and reporting to, and understanding what threats that are occurring, and if you're starting to see some increases in that. Policies and procedures are often done on the calendar, strategic planning calendar, but they're often executed on a quarterly basis based on the budgetary organization. So I would look at least on a quarterly basis, take a look at your priorities that you set up earlier in the year, understand what's going on in terms of cyber threats. For example, patch management up until May was probably not as high on everyone's list of concerns until after the WannaCry, and you want to adjust at that point to alleviate that potential threat going forward. So annual plan at a minimum, a quarterly review of that plan at a minimum, and then adjust as you go along and you learn what's going on in the environment would be good operating methodology.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dino, for your time today, and thank you to everybody who was able to join us. Again, we will be sure to send a copy of this recorded presentation to you after the webinar. And if you're still looking for additional information, we do encourage you to go check out the website that Dino had referenced, greatbaysoftware.com/resources, for lots of great information and continued learning. Thank you again.